You're listening to The Dirt on the Past, a show on history and archaeology and why it matters today. You can find us on the Extreme History Project website and also on kgvm.org. Thanks for listening. Welcome to The Dirt on the Past from the Extreme History Project and KGVM Community Radio.
Whether digging up a site or dusting off the archives, we bring you some of the most fascinating and cutting-edge research in history and archaeology and discuss why it matters today. Join me, Nancy Mahoney, alongside co-host Crystal Alegria, as we converse with anthropologists, archaeologists,
and historians about how they bring the past alive.
Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. This week we are at the Extreme History headquarters speaking in person, what a treat, with Scott Carpenter. We're excited to talk with Scott about a multitude of topics about historic preservation and archaeology. But before we introduce Scott, Crystal, I want to catch up with you. How was your week?
Oh, it was a wonderful week, Nancy. We had a great time. We started our walking tours.
Oh, officially started
Fantastic. Our walking tours this last weekend. So that it's so much fun to get going again, especially since we really didn't do the walking tours last summer. So
it's been over a year then.
It's been over a year. So we're so excited. And all the tour guides are back in and doing tours, and so it was great to get to work with all of them again. And just really in the last week or so we've been fine-tuning the tours for their debuts this weekend, so it's been fun to walk the streets of Bozeman again with all our walking tour guides and kind of update them and them update me about what they've learned about their tours over the course of the last year, and just really get to do history with people again.
I know that's got to feel really good. What are the tour names again?
So this summer we're running Murders, Madams, and Mediums, which is a good one. Of course our most popular tour, and then we are running our popular cemetery tour. We're also running a red light district tour, which is popular as well.
And this is new this year?
That's new. It was new 2 years ago.
Okay.
So, but kind of new this year still.
Still one of the newer ones.
Yeah, one of the newer ones. And then we ran our Main Street tour, which our intern Maggie did beautifully. So she started working as a tour guide for us this weekend as well. And
that's exciting.
Yeah, so we've been working with her on doing that tour for the past month or so. And,
was she nervous?
She was extremely nervous. Poor Maggie. She was really nervous, but she did a wonderful job and everyone loved it.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I got good reviews on her tour. So she's excited to keep doing it. And she's in between, she just finished with a degree in history, and now she's going to be going to graduate school next fall. So this is kind of her interim.
Wow. It's exciting. And you guys had beautiful weather the whole weekend. We finally had spring and summer all at once come to Bozeman. So that must have been nice for the tours.
It was great. No rain. No rain in sight this last weekend. So that really helped.
Awesome.
What about you, Nancy?
Yeah, it was gorgeous, and I was super glad to not actually have to be in the shop because it was flooded with tourists. So we had a lot of people, which was great. A lot of people here for Memorial Day. It was my 20th wedding anniversary last week. So
happy anniversary.
That's a big milestone. Didn't you have yours pretty recently?
We did. Yeah, we had our anniversary mid-May.
Yeah.
May 16th, which was 23 for us. So,
okay, wow, you are ahead of us. Yeah. Well, we were happy to make it to second decade, and I celebrated it alone since my husband's in Columbia.
Your husband is nowhere even close to Bozeman.
No, that's probably the best way for us. Yeah. We're both doing what we need to do. We'll celebrate when we head off to Italy. So that's good. So I had a lot of time to get back outside and hike with my dogs. We have all the elk, which had just dropped all their new babies that are just over the ridge from where my house is. So that was super fun. And we're hiring some new folks at the store. And then everybody's high school graduations are coming up this next weekend. So you and I don't have one, but we certainly know a lot of people. I know I do, and I'm sure you do too. We have a lot of friends with. So this coming up weekend, there'll be a lot of graduation parties, and that's always fun too.
Yeah.
So.
It makes me think, though, of, our kids both graduate. We had graduates last year from high school, and now we have a year off, but then we both have kids who are graduating next year. So I'm like, okay, I got to prep for next year already. I've got to start thinking about it.
And I think the announcements get more elaborate every year as they go out, but at least this year it'll be a real graduation, unlike last year, which was a little disappointing, but it still happened. So we should probably turn back to our guest.
We should.
Yeah. So Scott, excited. We're excited to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
We want to start by telling our listeners a little bit about you. So Scott Carpenter is, I believe you're the founder and the owner of Inter-Resources Planning, Inc.
Correct.
Here in Bozeman. So you're the senior archaeologist and cultural resources planner there, and you have more than 45 years of professional experience in the fields of archaeology, history, architectural history, cultural ecology, ethnography. We're still going here. Tribal consultations and historic preservation planning. So a really impressive array of related things, but not everybody else, I don't think, has always been able over their career to really deal with all of those things. So Scott, I think you have a really unique and fascinating career. Scott received his BA in anthropology with a specialization in North American archaeology from the University of Colorado, and his master's in museum studies with a focus in American history, historical archaeology, and historic preservation from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which is where I also received my master's degree. Scott's current research interests include cultural ecology, prehistoric site settlement patterns, stone tool technologies, historic architecture and construction technologies, and historic preservation. Scott has worked for the Smithsonian, for the National Park Service, in both places as a research archaeologist and as a cultural resources manager for over 20 years, including 15 years at Yosemite National Park as the Chief of Cultural Resources. He's published and edited several hundred project reports, technical studies, and scholarly publication, and has worked also on projects throughout other parts of the United States, Russia, and China. Scott, it's great to have you here.
Thanks. And I also do windows.
Huge bonus.
All that and windows,
especially those dirty historic windows.
Yeah.
Right. So, Scott, we often like to start off by asking our guests how they became interested in history and archaeology and what really they think might have set them on this path that ended up being a career for them.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm probably one of those classic stories of a young boy in about the fourth grade finally realizing the difference between searching for dinosaurs and archaeology, and that there is a difference. And friends of my parents were in graduate school at the University of Colorado at the time, and I kind of tagged along on a few field trips, an hour here, an hour there. And they were fortunate to go to the Nubian project the University of Colorado did.
Oh, wow.
And in the 1960s. And, of course, they sent me postcards about once a week. And then when they came back, came to my school and gave lectures. And then from then on, I worked with Dr. Buckles in the field. I would hold the dumb end of a tape on site surveys, and then by the time I was in high school, I was recording sites with him and analyzing artifacts, and so it was just kind of a natural progression right into college at that
Fantastic.
time.
Yeah. So you just right away had an interest.
Yeah.
And kind of knew. What did your parents think? Did they know this was? I mean, I guess they had friends who were doing it, so they felt that you could have.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, we've never really talked about it. I think they just assumed that would occur as well. Yeah.
It was kind of a natural progression from what you were doing, you know.
They weren't like business school, lawyer, doctor.
No, my dad was a chemist, so he was very analytical. We worked together on a few ancillary projects where he would provide chemical support for soil studies, mass spectrometry studies, and things like that. So, yeah, he was always interested in that.
Nice.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, you're not the first one of our guests who has come to archaeology that way. We've had a few people say that they got interested and just started working on projects in high school. So I think that's great. You know, it's great to get kids interested at that early age, get them hooked. and then they have no other choice. But then
Well, and also let
go
them
in.
know about some of the drawbacks and challenges. I think a lot of adults get into archaeology by way of a novel, Agatha Christie, or watching on television, and then by the time they're 25, 30 years old, they end up outside and realize, I'm really not cut out for doing all this. Whereas I think if you get into it early, you kind of stay with it longer. So.
Yeah. You
and
know what to expect.
Right.
Yeah.
But, that point about, holding the end of the tape and then progressing, it's an easy place that if you have an interested kid to give them something to do, whether they're helping with the screens, whether they're doing some things, there's ways for them to be in the field and to feel useful and like that they're doing some real science and field work. So I think that it is a nice way if someone's inclined that way. And I just think it's way more fascinating than dinosaurs, but that's my bias.
Personal.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, on this podcast, we've talked a lot about the Anzac site, and I know you've worked a lot around the history of the Anzac site as well during your career, so you know all about it and could probably speak for an hour on the Anzac site alone. But I want to talk a little bit about a different cache site that you've been personally involved with that was discovered very close to where the Anzac site was discovered in the 1960s. So this is another cache site, and I'll have you explain exactly what that means here in a minute. But this was another cache site that was discovered just a few years ago near Livingston, Montana, which is about 30 miles from where, well, probably not even that, from where the Anzac site was located. Of course, the time periods were very different of these two cache sites. But I love your research into this archaeological site that was a cache. And I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what a cache site is and what this one looked like, what the time frame for it was, and kind of your interpretation of this site. So,
sure. Yeah. And it's informally known as the Yearling Springs site, and near Livingston. And I think our experience and work with it wouldn't have come about if it hadn't been for extreme history. I'm not sure if you remember that.
I do.
Okay, good. At least you didn't bribe me to bring this point up. But it's one of those classic stories. And of course, being an archaeologist, you always get called, especially on a 4th of July weekend, which that ended up being. Gee, I found some bones in my backyard, and can you come and look at it, and all this kind of stuff. And they end up being dog bones or soup bones from a few years back, and nothing too excited. But an individual who was with the Project Archaeology program, and she was an elementary school teacher.
Yeah, in Livingston.
In Livingston, was walking her dog, and they were kind of being harassed by a coyote nearby. So they dropped down into this drainage, and she looked on the ground, and there are these large, medium pieces of obsidian, volcanic glass, black volcanic glass. And she commented to me later that normally she would have never thought anything about that, but because she knew about obsidian and where archaeological sites would be and everything else, she thought, wow, this is really strange. And of course, I think she called you, and then you called Dr. Jack Fisher and myself, and it sounded something better than just old soup bones in one's backyard. So we kind of jumped on it, and we had a picture in our mind of what we might see when we got out there. A few flakes of obsidian, which in our experience is fairly common, but we get out there, and one of them was larger than a large dinner plate.
Wow.
And you could see it from probably 60, 70 feet away. And they were all sitting on top of the grass, which was really interesting. And it was a cut of an old ranch road, it's probably a 2-track road, but a small cut that had, as the snow melted, the mud just sloughed out, and these artifacts spilled out from the ground and slid across the grass. And they still were coated with red ochre, which was a very unique situation. So Jack and I and Philip Fisher, Jack's son, who's carrying on the torch, and various other people, we worked on that site for a better part of 2 years. The really interesting thing about that site, being a cache, which is a place, it's the French word for collecting things in one place. So a powder cache for trappers or hunters would be gunpowder cached in one, or a food cache or something. So they're usually single, not necessarily single event, but single purpose locations. So as opposed to doing an archaeological excavation of a large site that is a ceremonial site, a habitation site, a tool production site, a cooking site, a food processing site, all these different things together, which gets confusing because all of them are happening together. This is just one little activity that comprises that site. So
it's like a storage site in some ways that probably somebody intended to come back to. Is that presumably?
Yeah. And we will never really know, but we were able to do work, and we actually excavated down and found some of the obsidian pieces still in place in their original context, and a small pit that was lined with red ochre. And then in excavating this grass layer where these obsidian flakes were observed on top of the new grass, because they weeks ago just slid across
They just kind of slid out.
Yeah, we found some in the sod layer. So this had slid out once before, about 20, 25 years prior.
But nobody had seen it.
Nobody had seen it. They got grass grew up around it.
So then they just got covered
Thank
up.
goodness you went ahead and tested it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easily one of those things that someone might have said, oh, we found the pit, and moved on. Wow.
So we found upwards of, I think it was a total of 98 fragments of obsidian. They all came from Obsidian Cliff in Yellowstone National Park. And of course, this gets back to some of our discussions, too, that we talk about with extreme history, is that people always look for the exact place that someone was, not the history of the whole story, but where did George Washington sleep, or where did the Lewis and Clark people, where are their footprints in the earth? And of course, when we started on the project, a few other people, the rancher and a few other people were, because they knew about Anzick, they wanted this to be as old as Anzick. So older is better. Yeah. And yet it's not. I mean, old is great. But, and speaking from somebody my age, I like to think it's a little bit, good.
It's a little something
but there are some unique things that happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So it ended up that this site, we did some special analyses of the soils and other things, and found out the site was about 3,000 years old. So not as old as Anzick, but again,
still very old.
Yeah. And then trying to figure out why were those things cast there. There were no finished tools, no detritus or debitage from making other tools. They were just these large preforms and blanks that could have been used.
So when you say preforms and blanks, you actually mean people took hunks of obsidian from Obsidian Cliff, did some basic shaping so that they would have served sort of as a core or a shape that later you could take some off of and make tools from. Yeah. Okay, just so
Very
people understand.
Yeah.
So those were taken. Someone carried them. I don't know how much all this weighed.
Well, it's about 35 pounds.
35 pounds. That was taken.
So maybe one trip, two trips, two people,
and
one person.
How many miles to Obsidian Cliff roughly?
It's about straight line distance. It's probably about 70 miles. Yeah.
Okay, and maybe could have been on the river for some of it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So it could have been brought over years. It could have been kind of a checkout place. It could have been a ceremonial place that these were really important for blessing for hunting. We just don't know because.
And do you think that's maybe why the ochre was within it as well? Because you said they were all covered with ochre.
Yeah, and they were in an ochre-lined pit. Yeah. Ochre has been it's a hematite or iron oxide, and it occurs naturally many places around the globe. And it's been traced to archaeological sites throughout the world, including South Africa, going back hundreds of thousands of years. It's used for medicinal purposes and also for painting, rock art, painting on the skin, tattoos, things like that. So we conjectured that maybe it was a special place, and maybe like flagging tape today. Oh, go to that place just above the river along that creek, and you'll see this red stuff in the soil. Dig down, and you'll take what you need.
Right.
Or it was a ceremonial blessing, and we will never know that part of the story.
Right. And you say, in your article that you wrote about it as maybe our protection even.
Yeah.
You know, maybe that ochre was used as a protection for these pieces so they would be there the next time the person came to get them, or
So when people talk about Anzac and think about Anzac, they know that there was also a large cache of artifacts. And it was a different cache, which I want to get to in a second, but there were also human remains. Subsequently, all that has been dated. There was also some ochre involved in that cache, but it was a large amount of stone tools. Some obsidian, but it wasn't all obsidian like this. So if you hadn't had the ability to date, looking at just the artifacts themselves that you found, what is the difference between how the artifacts in the Anzac site look and what's contained in that cache versus what these ones looked like?
Right. Well, the most of the artifacts at the Anzac site were finished artifacts, and they were from the Clovis period. Generally, obsidian in this area of the world, or this area of the Rocky Mountains, was not used as much for tools, stone tools, until the last few thousand years.
During the Clovis period, they weren't. Right?
Occasionally, you will find those in Wyoming, Colorado. It was not the main preferred. Okay. Yeah, that there were so many other types of material that was being used, and we don't know why that was. But they were finished tools. These, now, obsidian, we can understand how old the artifacts are by doing obsidian hydration dating, where obsidian, being a glass, absorbs molecular moisture, and we can actually look at it under a microscope and determine a relative time period that has elapsed since that artifact was made. And with the chert and other types of stone at Anzac site, you could not date just finding an artifact. So we did have that because of the obsidian. Then we also used another technique called, this is $1 million word, optically stimulated luminescence dating of soils.
This is good. It makes us sound really sciencey.
Right.
So yeah, love it.
Well, and I think it's because if it didn't have that big name, we wouldn't pay thousands of dollars to have the analysis done. It would only be $30. But anyway, OSL dating, we could date the soil layers around it. And we were hoping to find carbon, but there wasn't any carbon to do carbon-14. And you can't really do much. Ochre is so ubiquitous that it's hard to really tell.
Just source it or something.
But our OSL dating and the obsidian dating were fairly close, which is good to know because an artifact, these preforms could have been made 3,000 years ago and deposited in Gardner, and then someone 500 years ago picked them up in Gardner and brought 35 pounds of obsidian to Livingston and buried them with ochre. But because the dates are really close to the same, we know it was one event or a series of events. You know, they might have been over a couple of years or something like that.
But within one person's lifetime.
Yeah, and we even did analyses of bagware. If you take a lot of these big pieces and small pieces, and 35 pounds of rock on your back for 50, 60 miles is quite an effort, and they're banging around and things like that, you would find a lot of extra flaking of this glass along the edges. And there was very little of it. So were they each individually wrapped in deerskin?
Right.
Or were they carried by two different people? Or, you know, and so Philip Fisher at the time made some similar artifacts out of stone that was never used prehistorically, and he put them in a pack and he carried them for X number of miles. And then he photographed
some experimental archaeology.
Yeah, he photographed them ahead of time.
Fantastic.
and then tried to figure out what the difference was.
Yeah.
And it appears as though there's very little what we call bagware or transport wear. Now, it could be that each artifact was carried by one person, which would mean a very different type of scenario.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I love kind of playing with all of that. Now, this is not the only cache site in North America that contains artifacts and or obsidian artifacts. Can you tell us a little bit about where else we find them and how this compares to some of them?
Yeah, there's some large and some small. There are some that are found in association with other archaeological sites. This, by the very nature of the physical erosion of the site and sliding down the hill of these large pieces, someone would have never found this site.
Right.
As soon as the grass grew in one more season, these artifacts would have been reburied. Because the nearest recorded archaeological site is perhaps a quarter to a half mile away. So rarely do we work on a single large site and then have the good fortune to be able to look a quarter mile away at every square inch and excavate to see what is buried. Basically, that cache was smaller than the size of this table.
Right.
So even if we were on a site nearby, you could look right to the right of this table and you could look right to the left and not find anything. And only right where, if you looked right where the artifacts were, is the only way that you could have found them.
Yeah.
So
this is what's always so fascinating to me about what might still be out there. I love stories
exactly.
like this. I know.
Right.
Yeah.
And if Robin hadn't been, if that coyote hadn't pushed her over, that was not her normal route for walking. So she probably would have never even seen these artifacts. And so Robin Lubbock is a teacher in Livingston, and she's the one who kind of came across these artifacts. And she had done a lot of work with project archaeology, but also with extreme history, and had gone to some trainings and different things. So she did have that eye for artifacts. She, and like you said, if she hadn't.
And she knew who to call.
Yeah, she knew. So the funny thing about it is I got the call from Robin about when she was out at the site looking at these big obsidian pieces on the grass. And I was in a dressing room in TJ Maxx. and I saw it was Robin calling. So I picked up as I was trying on some clothes. And she's like, Crystal, there's these huge obsidian artifacts on the ground, and I don't know where they came from, but I've got to send you some pictures of them. So I said, okay, we'll send them, And so she forwarded me these pictures, and I was just blown away because they're huge, and they're this beautiful obsidian, black obsidian. Mm-hmm. And so I just said, well, Robin, where are you? And how did you find these? And she kind of gave me the scenario. And I said, well, how many are there? And she says, well, I see at least 20.
Yeah. I think there were 22 at the beginning.
I was just stunned. I couldn't believe it. And I said, well, okay, well, let me call Scott Carpenter. I think I had her call you first, and maybe then Jack right away. But
you're like, let me get dressed.
Yeah, let me put my pants on. And so then I remember forwarding you the pictures that she had forwarded me, and so it was so amazing. Wow. But then but she was involved in it as of course, was the landowner the whole time, and the landowners were very excited about this, and were very a huge part of this project the whole time, as I remember as well. So it was really a neat
it's definitely a project that was born out of coincidence. And just being at the right place at the right time, and every step of the way of doing analysis. And we should bring up, and I don't want to read anything into the whole thing, but Robin's husband's name is Cash.
Oh, that's right.
So,
well, there you go. Whatever.
So,
So I love thinking about the way people were using the landscape. Mm-hmm. We know there are caches from Clovis era, which is, 10,000, 12,000 years ago, and then we're talking, this one is 3,000. So people continued to use the landscape that way, and where they'd go and get these raw materials. It's so interesting to think about what ways in which we document how people moved and used all the different resources.
And people are geocaching today.
Yeah,
right,
exactly. Yeah. And God knows what else they're caching out there these days, right?
So
pandemic times.
One more question too, Scott. You did some analysis of the fats or the lipids that were found. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, a lot of times there's ethnographic documentation of the use of ochre for different things, for paint, for rock art, for paint on hides and decorative purposes, tools, and also for face paints. And there's a lot of accounts of mixture of animal fats with the ochre. Otherwise, it's kind of a dusty, chalky material, which if you're drawing a hopscotch board on your sidewalk or putting a little bit of coloring on your face, ochre will do fine for a little while, but the dust is it succumbs to a lot of moisture and even the wind and things like that. So by adding grease to it, it will make it'll be like
it's
even
like a binder, because like for rock art and cave paintings and
lipstick,
probably
early
body
lipsticks
painting,
use
you would
mineral
be
colors,
putting in,
right.
you would be mixing it with fats and oils.
Right.
So you found that then in with this ochre. So it was really intentional to line the pit, didn't just blow in from somewhere.
Well, there was a real question too. So we did both starch and to look for plant substances, and then trace blood analysis of the material. And we found percentages of bear and trout or salmonid, so it could have been salmon or trout. So it was a mixture of fish, bear, and then some deer. Now the question was this all wrapped in a deerskin bag and then buried into the ochre, and then the deerskin deteriorated over time? So we'll never know for sure.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And what do you think about the bear? Do you think that the ochre was mixed with bear
Probably bear
grease?
Grease.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And that's interesting. And the trout, how does that come into this? Unless it was just within.
Yeah, and again, without
within
being there,
bag.
we will never know.
Yeah.
But was there one extreme story is that the recipe for this kind of cache handed down by certain people is X amount of bear, X amount of fish, X amount of deer, to make it and do it in such a way for certain spiritual reasons. The other side of the continuum for coming up with a story or an answer might be, well, gee, what's over there by the campfire right now? Well, there's a little bit of bear over here. Oh, there's a little bit of fish over here.
Exactly.
Yeah, and just put together. And again, we'll never know.
Right.
It's romantic to think about all the different ways.
But to me, it means they had access at least to all of those animals.
Yeah.
I mean, deer doesn't surprise you, but bear requires certain challenges. And fish, we don't think of necessarily every group of indigenous people we know all consuming fish or not. Some do, some don't, some have taboos. So interestingly, it seems like the people who maybe made this cache probably were catching and or consuming fish.
And now whether or not the consumption or the use of fish was solely for this purpose and not for other things, again, we have one tiny site found by circumstance, and we're trying to recreate
everything
the whole
out of it,
thing.
though. You can with the analysis.
Now,
which is
if we
great.
found 4 or 5 more of those over the years nearby, and they all had the same percentage of animal fat, and they all had this, that we might then be able to say, oh, this seems to be a pattern.
Right.
One instance doesn't make a pattern. It makes a neat little story and a neat little collection.
Yeah, and that's the importance of finding these other caches to see those patterns and better understand that story.
All right, people, go walk your dogs.
Yeah.
Get out there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we're going to pivot a little bit. Because, Scott, you've worked extensively with the National Park Service, and you have, I don't know, it says here, Crystal, finishing your career. I'm not sure that you're really at the end of your career, Scott. So we'll say
maybe my Park Service career.
Yeah, you retired.
Finishing up maybe your Park Service career
Yeah.
as the Chief of Cultural Resources for Yosemite National Park. It's fun for us to talk to you about that, especially because we had interviewed Laurel Angel earlier on. And have you all met? I don't know.
No, I've not met her yet.
But
Although I may have passed by her
Okay.
when she was younger, but
Right, because she's the one who grew up there. And
Right,
her dad
right,
worked
yeah,
there. And
yeah.
so I
And
think
you
we
knew-
talked that you knew
Yeah,
maybe
I worked
her
with
dad.
her dad.
Yes,
Yeah, that
okay,
was it.
that's right. So we know you worked closely, you have worked closely with indigenous descendant communities during your time at Yosemite, and we were wondering if you could speak to the relationship of the National Park Service to descendant communities and their ability, desire, outreach to work with descendant communities, and how that relationship has been in the past, how it has evolved, and how you might seeing it evolve in the future. We were both drawn to the recent article in The Atlantic by David Truer entitled "Return the National Parks to the Tribes." And David Truer was making a very interesting case about how to think about these lands, how they became parks, and who might be good stewards of these lands. So we were wondering if you could talk a little bit about your involvement with the national park specifically, and just in general about these pretty important topics right now.
Yeah, and that's a fascinating subject, with almost like trying to study a small cache near Livingston, Montana. We have a lot of opinions and a lot of ideas, but no one thing that clearly points us in the right direction at the right time. But the National Park Service, which has been actually only in existence for a little more than 100 years. It was created in 1916, but the first national park being Yellowstone in 1872, so it'd be about 150 years old. Seems like a long time for our history and our understanding of land, natural and cultural conservation and preservation, but just a blink of the eye when it comes to the other people who walk these lands and cache tools all over the place for thousands and thousands of years, and a real array of cultural groups, tribes, ancestral groups, and a lot of different ecological landscapes in the national parks. And it's interesting that the Park Service came to the realization in the 1950s, 1960s that national parks were not just natural entities, landscapes and water and people, that it was a real intertwining of culture and nature. And cultural resources has always played second fiddle by and large, unless the really big archaeological parks like Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Casa Grande, places like that had maybe a team of archaeologists before they had a botanist. Whereas the big national parks like Yellowstone and things like that had wildlife specialists, botanists, foresters, before they ever had historians and archaeologists. So, and as you all know from the understanding and the work that you do with extreme history, is that you just can't separate one thing and look at it. You've got to look at the whole thing together, which is why I like cultural ecology, to really see what the importance of, so that if you find a cache and it has bear grease, well, then you've got to talk to a wildlife biologist or a fisheries biologist to figure out all these things together. And the national parks grew out of a time run by the military, which for our history had some real implications in the 1870s of what the military was doing in the West. And I would say many, but I think all of the national parks that had Native American settlements and locales that were still active at the time, not just prehistoric abandoned sites, grew out of an engineered method to remove the people from the landscape. And not unlike removing indigenous peoples to reservations because of the need to find minerals, or the need to move a railroad through an area, or to build a community or something like that. The National Park Service, all by one entity, did that in a very purposeful manner. In the 1950s, that realization, there was that rekindling of the understanding of how important Native peoples were to the history and natural history of our landscape. So probably in about the 1950s, 1960s, there was a increased awareness. There were more museums dedicated to American history and to Native history in national parks, understanding of art and culture and things like that. But it was taught by, or understood by and written by and taught by the Park Service, and occasionally bringing in a representative, maybe not from the same tribe, and maybe not the same regalia, but to show. And it was with an understanding that these are lost cultures, the vanished cultures.
They're vanished, right.
Which, of course, they were not.
Right.
Yeah. And
in Trur's article, he starts out talking about Yosemite and the Mariposa Battalion of 1851. And the folks with whom I've been very graced to work with for over 40 years now. One individual in particular, his great-grandmother traced her birth in Yosemite Valley to, they don't know the exact year, but around the 1830s. So 20 years before the arrival of Mariposa Battalion. As soon as they came and the Indians dispersed through the area, and a lot of interaction with other tribes and other groups, there was almost a hidden culture going on. If a group of white people came forward and said, "Gee, are you from this group that used to be in Yosemite?" Many of them would say, "No, I'm not," even though they were, because they didn't, because they remembered that the last time somebody said that, they were killed.
Right.
So when friends of mine in the 1970s went to the Smithsonian because they were in Washington to petition the federal government for federal acknowledgement as an Indian tribe that had been lost, quote, vanished, they got to see an exhibit on the Miwok people in the Smithsonian that said the tribe vanished, and he said, "No, we haven't. I'm right here." You know?
Yeah.
And they've been working to this day. Their petition has not been completed. And they've been working on...
They haven't been recognized.
Right, formally recognized,
wow.
yeah. Mm-hmm. And starting in 1982, we worked with them to get a small parcel of land in Yosemite Valley dedicated and under permit, because we can't, without an act of Congress, we can't grant land back to a tribe, or without a treaty or something.
Okay.
So, but we could permit the use of that land in exclusivity to build a ceremonial roundhouse. So as opposed to the Park Service building a historically accurate roundhouse and talking to some people from tribes and how did you use it, and what were the songs you did, and then have other people run these programs and occasionally have local Native people come in and participate. This is set up by them, for them, and then with the purpose of explaining to the public what their
So the
ways
public
are
can
like.
come in and view these, view the roundhouse and their ceremonies within.
Yeah,
But it's all under it's their project.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And that was because there's another tribe involved called the federal government, which is a chief and a lot of other folks and taboos and their own language and kinship and everything else. And decisions move very slowly. So that's been over 30 years, and that process the roundhouse is being constructed right now, and hopefully will be finished.
Wow, that's exciting.
Yeah.
Well, that's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big step forward towards just, I think, in people's mind, it creates a much, I mean, that's the other thing when you mentioned about Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. I mean, there was physical architecture, impressive physical architecture. So you had the archaeologists in this sense of this being a place where people inhabited, even if they weren't inhabited when people showed up who were Euro-American. But, you know, Yosemite and Yellowstone didn't have so much obvious physical architecture. You know, there was camps and things. So I think that sense, I mean, so how phenomenal to be able to build a roundhouse. I think it just, in a lot of ways, changes the way people understand the landscape and who is using it just by seeing that bit of architecture. I mean, it's way too little too late, but perhaps it's the start of changing perceptions.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the difficulty lies in what kind of a Pandora's box is being opened by allowing something. It's one of the few places. I mean, there are other parks that have allowed, either through treaty or other arrangements, certain uses, but to actually permit a segment of land, in a sense, as rented land within a national park, why don't we let other people do it? Or like hunting rights in a national park. Well, if we let local natives use that, then what are we going to tell the other people who have grown up here for 9 generations but are not Native Americans, you know, things like that. And I think the Park Service is on that cusp of facing some of these difficult issues and realizing that oh, we don't want to open a can of worms. That's always just too easy to say. That no matter what you do in the National Park Service or the federal government or anything, any organization, if you're doing something right, you're going to be opening a can of worms. And if it's not over here, it's going to be over here. And so you might as well address those things. I think having Deb Haaland as Secretary of Interior now helps out, because she brings that kind of awareness to things that are important, not only to certain groups of people that have been ignored for so long or actually been physically removed, but important to the other people who have learned life without seeing the can of worms, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, definitely. There's a potential for many things to sort of change. But
and we had Shane Doyle on the podcast a few months ago, and he was talking about kind of that same idea in Yellowstone, having an area in Yellowstone where indigenous people who once lived on these lands could build structures. They could, kind of recreate that lifestyle, but also show modern ceremony, modern powwow situations. And so he talked about that on the podcast. I think he actually talked about that in an article that was written about Yellowstone as well. But it's kind of that same idea, But I like going that step further and having the land belong to those people. And so I think that would be something that if, Yosemite's doing it, maybe it could be modeled in other national parks as well. Or it could be, it's modeled in Yosemite, but it could be done in other national parks as well. So that would be great.
And also in Yosemite, in addition to the specific small plot of land of a few acres to build a roundhouse, in Yosemite Valley, there are other agreements with 7 affiliated tribes, which allow them various uses throughout the park for ceremonial, traditional, whatever. And quite a few national parks have that, so that's a good step.
And state parks too.
Yeah, state parks too. Yeah, right.
Yeah, and David Truer in this article, of course, goes a lot farther and says that the state or that the national parks should be given back to the tribes and to the land, those tribal nations that once owned that land. And, there is models for that happening right now as well. In South Dakota with Bear Butte, that has been given back to the local indigenous people in that area. So there are things moving in that direction, I would say.
Yeah, and in other countries, New Zealand and Australia.
Yeah, right.
And also I was recently in 2019, I was in New Zealand with the Ngorongoro Conservation Area Authority, which is kind of an equivalent to our National Park Service. And going back into the 1950s, when Britain controlled Tanganyika, and the need to preserve natural landscape and natural ecology and wildlife in the Serengeti was so important, they ran the Maasai off
because they are cattle herders, right? Pastoralists.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. So they took hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of acres away from that, but set up immediately a place where the Maasai could live, and then that became the Ngorongoro Crater Natural Preserve Area. But then once the natural resources people saw, wow, there's some amazing wildlife ecology going on here and plant ecology and everything else. So there was a smaller number in 1950. There was a smaller number of Maasai living there, and and I think Truer's article says it would be great to give it back to the tribal groups and forget about all the conflicts and the politics. Well, as we all know, human nature is human nature. And what's happened in Tanzania now, and with the creation of Tanzania out of Tanganyika and Zanzibar and transferring to the British in 1961, they adopted that same rule, and the Ngorongoro Crater and the conservation area grew. Now there's something like 6 times the population on this same area of land, more research being done about erosion, wildlife habitat, all sorts of things. And certain political groups have, within the Maasai, have gained more power than other groups. And then certain things have happened. So now they're thinking about dividing up the area again and giving actually a little bit more land to the Maasai, but it has no water. So for pastoralists, you need the water. And then by dividing the big land up into quarters, what's that doing to wildlife migration routes and everything else? So it's like, there's a lot of good examples out there to see what happens. I don't think there's an easy solution. I am truly, I think in certain national parks or certain areas of national parks, to let the local native people, but not, I'd hate to see politically astute, larger tribal groups in consortium running all the national parks as opposed to making sure that the people who are indigenous to those areas are the ones that are responsible for it.
Yeah. Well, good. I think what his article was great about is just kind of putting it out there. And as we celebrate Yellowstone's 150th anniversary next year, I think there will be more discussions about this and moving in that direction. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and I didn't know that about Yosemite. I think that's fascinating. I mean, thinking about what Shane was saying about Yellowstone, where I think his idea was having a whole bunch of different teepees that were all painted in the styles of their different, and then as you said, having ceremonies. I think that idea is that people would actually love to see that in Yellowstone, but I think, again, it would also remind people that this was a place that always had certain tribes coming through and using it. And this whole concept of wilderness and these empty landscapes would little by little kind of fall away so that we can start making room for more possibilities, like what's going on in Yosemite. And I think we start with these ideas and then you see what happens. But like you said, there's a can of worms. We all know there's going to be a can of worms, but that doesn't mean we just keep doing what we did, which was wrong. Yeah. So no easy answers there, but it is good for folks like David Truer to put it out there.
Right.
I'd recommend one book. I jotted down here. I was going to bring a copy, but it's Dispossessing the Wilderness.
Yeah. If
you've seen that by David Spencer back in 2000. And it really goes into detail on a lot of the ideas. And I think that's what's important about extreme history is that Truer writes that article, and it's in Atlantic when a lot of people read it. And that elevates the conversation to the dinner table. But what extreme history does is takes it a little bit further because everybody assumes if you read it in the Atlantic, oh, gee, that's good. The article's over. I understand it now. Well, no, it is so complex, nobody really understands it yet. Yeah. Whereas groups like extreme history, Native American groups, all sorts of people have their own views that take it one step further to be able to start getting a sense of what the actual answers might be on those.
Right. And having conversations around it and then changing policy, and educating the public about it. And that's,
and listening. It's the having the conversations, which means you're listening as much as you're saying. And people have to be brought up to date on the history that maybe they didn't get. I mean, so much of this history I've only learned in the last 15 years of my life, And then it overturns the way you think about things, but it doesn't mean that all of a sudden then there's a clear answer. But it does mean that a lot of people, I think, have to understand the history in its full complexity in order to really understand why moving forward in a different way that maybe they didn't consider it was possible. So I love that idea, and I think you're right. It's like this is what public history should be doing, bringing these conversations out.
Yeah, and that's our whole mission at Extreme History is to talk about educating about this history so we can better understand it and work with it today in our lives to, have these conversations that we're having right now. And where do we go with this? How do we move forward with this? And one thing that we didn't talk about, Scott, in your bio is that you are also a board member of Extreme History Project.
Absolutely. And you're not off the hook yet.
Yeah,
you've been there since the beginning.
You were one of our founding board members. You were the first of 3. 3 board members plus Marcia Fulton and myself. So there was 5 of us in the beginning, and you were one of the 5. Yeah. And so
I have a vested interest.
You do. And you help shape how we think about these things and how we've moved forward as extreme history, for sure. And kind of speaking to that public history aspect, we like to delve into these kind of stories because they're very complex, and that's important to us to understand complex stories and kind of widen out that traditional narrative to bring in all these other narratives that have either been pushed under the rug or pushed out or not considered or lost in some form or fashion. So that's what we do at Extreme History, and our goal is to really widen this history and understand those complexities so that we can understand our place in this world today. And so, you've been involved in public history, Scott, since the beginning of your career, not only with the Park Service, but everything you've done with inter-resources planning and in your other, jobs that you've done through your whole career. So can you just talk a little bit about what you think public history is, or what public archaeology is, and how you've used it in your career, and why you think it's so important for the public to be involved in history, archaeology, heritage?
Yeah, I think sort of as a preface, I think if you tell any kind of historical story or idea or exhibit or tour or something like that, it would be, or even television show that deals with a fairly rational approach to the historic story. It would be difficult to find people who are not interested. And yet, when it becomes more and more difficult to find people to take the next step to apply those things that we can learn. It's almost like it's a casual thing. Okay, I've learned my history, then walk away from it. But if we know our history and we learn our history and we continue to relearn it, because how many of us have come to realize just in the last 2 to 5 years that the history we learned was not all that accurate, right, for certain populations.
I think people are just learning about the Tulsa massacre now, right?
Yeah. So it makes one wonder how many other things are out there. I think Tulsa was not in isolation. The things that happened in the Cold War were not in isolation. Things that happened in the 1870s weren't just in isolation. And not that everyone in the population needs to take the time and the effort and the energy and the heartache to become a PhD in history or archaeology.
God, no.
Yeah. But to realize that there is one more step. And that's why I think the importance of public history and involved public history. So that it's not just somebody who knows something telling people who don't know it. It's involving them so that they start asking the questions. So that a recipient of Extreme Histories programs, Robin, can go out and go, wait, something is really different. I wouldn't have noticed it 2 years ago, but now I know something different. And an archaeological site is preserved because of that. So it doesn't mean that she learned to preserve the entire site and do all the work, but there aren't enough archaeologists and historians in the world to pull all this stuff together. So having the public know what it is they need, learn to look, learn to ask questions, and learn to be analytical, and which is really important with kids and development of critical thinking in schools today, so that
to be involved in
those things, so that
ask those questions.
They will come along and say, because this whole concept that we were talking about of giving the national parks to the native populations and tribes, well, that's just the way I said it is such a loaded.
It's like defund
statement.
the police. It just
Right.
it makes people completely nervous and freak out.
But it's such a loaded concept, a creative concept, worthy of thought. It's no different than in 1850 when Yosemite actually became the first national park. When Abraham Lincoln...
first state park.
Yeah,
State
state
park
preserve for
California.
national reasons. But anyway, well, that's a whole nother topic.
That's another podcast, Nancy.
That's the way I learned it.
What a great, innovative, creative process to create something that no one had ever thought about, and it became the national park system, which then became modeled all around the world, including Tanzania today. So why then, with a good cadre of thinking people out there in the public, that in 10 years from now we could say, gosh, this might be really creative and I don't know how we're going to do it, but let's put this land where it belongs as a national park and give it back to the native peoples. So that's no different than what the first concept of creating a national park is.
Okay, I love thinking about that because when you think about when Yellowstone was created, 1872, they they passed legislation, but they didn't pass any money to fund it. Right? So you had people, oh, cool, I don't even have to homestead this. I can just come in here, I can set up shop, I can take tourists through, I can hunt, and literally it was a free-for-all because it was just because the concept was so new. And like you said, it wasn't until 1916 that they actually funded the Organic Act, which funded the Park Service.
In 1916, I think it was $5,000.
Yeah.
They funded it, but they didn't fund it.
But they had to send in the military. They didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
And like you said, it was a creative idea, but it certainly was a stinker to begin with in terms of what it actually looked like.
Right. Be careful what you wish for.
Right, exactly.
So I think that's a really good point, is to look at Truer's article in that light. I was also going to say there's like the history of the past and the history of the future. And I would say the history of the past, it's like we are learning a lot of what we learned was either inaccurate or very incomplete. And it was done as a kind of a download, someone telling you. And sort of, I think the way we envision the history of the future, all of us here at Extreme History, is that it's engaged, it's public, but also it's to look for all those other untold voices and other threads, and then think about how they're going to affect the way we make decisions today. So I when people cling on to, but that's not the history I learned, and they don't want to hear, or they call something revisionist history, I don't think we can think of it as that dichotomy. It's really, there was a way history used to be done, and there's a way history is being done now and should always be done in the future, I think. And we're trying to do that in a much more engaged, accessible way. And hopefully that would get us past some of these really loggerhead disagreements. I don't know. We can't solve it all in this podcast. No. That's all I know. Okay, So where are we at? Do we need to ask Scott about William Clark marching back through Bozeman on his way out, heading back from the Pacific towards the Missouri? Should we ask him?
Let's ask Scott about that.
He did such a phenomenal job. I think you're probably the person who most closely tried to ground truth, where William Clark would have come back across through this area, right through parts of Bozeman, and had to get over the range back to Livingston and then back along the Yellowstone before he met back up with, who's the other guy again? Oh, yeah.
Meriwether Lewis?
Lewis, there we go. So,
you mean that guy? Yeah.
That guy. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about why you had to do that project, and then what you found, because this is a pretty fascinating one just for people in the area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has an interesting, again, by coincidence, because I was here and my office was here and I knew a little bit about the area. We were contracted by a developer between here and Livingston. They had to get a federal permit for their development for wetlands, for crossing with culverts or bridges on wetlands. And because that's a federal permit that requires an archaeological and historical survey of the area to see if there are any important historic sites or information that might be irretrievably lost due to the development. And that's most of the work that we have done in the past. And sometimes that work is very tedious and boring. It's a lot like fishing. They call it fishing, but they don't call it catching. You go out and you fish. So in archaeology, you go out and you look a lot, but
you survey.
Yeah, you don't always,
you don't find necessarily,
right.
or record,
or you might find a few small fragments of obsidian or a little bit of pottery or something like that, but not those truly remarkable things. So when you get an opportunity that you're in the neighborhood of Clark returning in July, and how that whole story evolved, that just by circumstance of being in the right place. And again, and we've talked about this in the past, is there's something very deep within our beings of, it's not enough to have a connection with an artifact, and how many artifacts do we not get to touch because they're in a museum, they're behind a case, but there's the need to touch things that someone else has made or touched before.
Or stand where someone stood.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Or, look and know that you're looking at something that someone looked at, 100 years ago or 10,000 years ago.
All the photographs of a national park entrance sign versus the number of photographs taken of certain places in national parks.
Right.
They'll always take the other pictures, but they do not leave a park without taking the photograph of that first one. So why are those things? And I remember a discussion years ago in San Francisco about trying to retrace the route of Drake up the coast and trying to find the original whitecaps that his ship cut through, as if that water would still be there.
Yeah.
And that's very symbolic of history, that even if we could find the footprints of Clark, what more we already know that he came this way. And we started to narrow it down a little bit more and where he camped. But basically in a nutshell, and I think it's probably the unforgotten list of the important women of the Lewis and Clark expedition, which, there was one.
Right.
And because Sakakawea knew the landscape, had been kidnapped as a child, taken over hundreds and hundreds of miles to be with a different group of people, always remembering where she'd been because she knew she wanted to get back at some point. And then she comes through with these couple of yahoos from St. Louis and further east, and as they came through on the way west, they came through Three Forks, what is today Three Forks, where the Missouri and Gallatin and Jefferson come together, all named by these great white guys.
I'm sure she knew it as something else.
Yeah. She looked over the hill and said, you were asking about that river, the Rochon, the Yellowstone River, and where it joins back up with the Missouri, way back at a place that we now know as the boundary with North Dakota. She says, if you go that way, you're going to make it right to that point. And so Clark was very, very interested, and went on the return route when Lewis was trying to find different routes around the Moraes Pass area and different ways in that area. Clark brought a smaller group of people and Sakakawea down this way, and she had pointed out the actual notch in the hillside where to go. Yeah. And then part of that retelling of history, and what's the purpose of history? There. And I'm not sure if it's still there, but by the park up here.
Yeah, Lindley Park.
Oh, yes, there's a plaque where it says they camped there. Well, I traced down some documentation, the Chamber of Commerce in the 1930s. Okay, since no one really knows, then we'll make it the camp spot here, because that would make more people want to come to Lindley Park. And it's kind of like, George Washington, and I had a historian friend back east who did a fictitious but actually became a really interesting paper. He calculated the age of George Washington based on the number of nights he slept in different places. And he would have to be...
I think I'd heard about this.
Either he moved every 5 minutes every
Washington
night.
slept here.
Yeah, or he was
that's
340
great.
years old.
That's funny.
And so why do we want... So it's another thing to want to sense history, but there are certain altruistic and sometimes economic goals to having history.
There are.
And I think even the developers wanted to know that there was a campsite on their land, not to prevent their development, but so that they could call it Clark Acres or something like that. You know?
They could claim that piece of history for themselves. Right. Exactly.
So when I ride my bike up Kelly Canyon now, there's another sign that talks about where Clark camped.
Right.
That's closer to where sort of the Fort Ellis sort of part of the East Gallatin is.
Yeah,
right?
and that's very close. We were able, because both Lewis and Clark, but Clark especially, was very astute at taking brief but important reflective notes of certain things. And of course he blazed a cottonwood tree going up Kelly Canyon.
It would have been amazing if that was still around.
But you know, good old cottonwoods.
Yeah,
How long
right.
is that going to last?
Right.
And if it fell just the right way, you'd never see the blaze anyway. But you know, he would say that they would go a roughly straight line for 1.5 miles or 3 miles or 6 miles at a certain compass direction, and then change, go another distance at another compass direction. So, and then we knew when he got to the Yellowstone River, and we knew when he left Three Forks. So you could kind of say, well, he couldn't, as some people thought, that Sakakawea had taken him over Sac Peak. Well, you've never heard that story before?
No.
Yeah, like Ross Pass and...
Right, right.
If you could get to the Yellowstone by going this route, wouldn't you rather go that way then?
Oh,
but if in fact you went through Ross Pass, over the Bridgers, down Bridger Canyon, around, you couldn't have gotten... with all these little segments that he measured.
It wouldn't have worked that way from what was in his notes. Okay, so you knew that was no. Okay.
So you can kind of piece together, and probably within where that plywood sign is probably within a quarter mile of where they were. Now, were they on one side of the river versus the other?
It doesn't matter. I'm seeing the same view pretty much.
Yeah,
that they saw. You know, that's what's fun to know for
and
me.
And that's neat. You know, some people do want to have it exactly, but I'm like you, Nancy. I'm like, you know, we're in the general area. That's really interesting. It's fascinating that they went through here. They saw the same mountain range as I'm seeing it pretty much today. So I think that's neat. You know, just a little bit about Sakakawea too. My friend Marcia Small always, whenever Sakakawea's name whenever it comes up, she always says, you know, we always think of her as this woman, you know, this very womanly woman. And she was a child. She was basically a child. So I just wanted to get that in there too. Right. I mean, she was not a woman. She was young. She was young. She was a preteen, you know, when this was happening. Yeah. So all the more kudos to her for all her knowledge she had at that young age. Yeah.
Amazing. And she was taken a long way. Only when I started really studying about the Mandan and the Hidatsa, when I was looking at the Hagen site, and then understanding the Shoshone where she came from, that it was supposedly a Hidatsa band that had come all the way that way and then taken her all the way back. That is a long way to travel and get taken from your family, because that's where she was found then ultimately, in those villages. But wow. All right, so that's another podcast for sure.
Whole another one.
Okay.
So Scott, do you have any last thoughts or comments? Anything you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to today?
I'm sure 2 or 3 hours from now I will think of one. Yes. But no, it's been a great opportunity to, you know, kick around ideas and tell a lot of old stories, but in a different way that, you know, makes me actually... I'm not just a teller of the stories. I'm actually thinking about, wow, what does that really mean now? That you know. But I really appreciate what you guys thought up how many years ago when you conceived of extreme history, and what an extreme thought that was to push the bubble and open the new can of worms and move ahead with that, because I think it's very beneficial. Yeah, and we've been opening cans of worms ever since. Yeah. And we'll continue to do so.
We need to get some of those in the gift shop.
I know we do. Well, thanks so much, Scott, and thank you so much for being here today. It's great to have you back in our neck of the woods again. You've been in California.
We'd never get you back from Yosemite. I know, so that's good.
So thank you, Scott, and thanks to all our listeners out there for joining us today. If you love this podcast, please share it with a friend and make sure to subscribe so it shows up for you each week on your podcast app. We also have a Facebook page called The Dirt on the Past, so make sure to find that and like it. We put links to all our podcast episodes in that Facebook page, but we also include links to articles, books, whatever we discuss on the podcast. So thanks again, Scott, and thanks to all of you listening. And we hope you can join us again to find out more about the dirt on the past.
A big thank you to our editor and sound guru, Steve Durbin, our social media maven, Maggie Mulcahy, and original music by Lawson Allegria. If you're enjoying The Dirt on the Past, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Also, please tell your friends and leave us a review. Really helps people find us. We're a new podcast and we're trying to grow our listener base, so please share. Thanks, and thanks for listening.
You've been listening to The Dirt on the Past, a podcast of the Extreme History Project and Gallatin Valley Community Radio, KGVM. To hear more episodes, visit our website at theextremehistoryproject.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep searching out the dirt on the past.